Hello and welcome to this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. What is in store for the energy sector in this country in the wake of the federal election? Our guest today has put it this way: Canada has the resources of an energy superpower, but not the attitude. I guess the next question is, do we have the tools to become that superpower with all our legislation in place and the rules that make it difficult to build the infrastructure? Heather Exner-Pirot. You say Pirot, do you?
Yes, yeah,
That's great.
that's the Cochin Francois senator.
Okay. This woman is from Saskatchewan, which I've just learned. Otherwise, of course, she would have been on the program 1,000 times. But let me just go through her resume here. A senior fellow and director of energy, natural resources, the environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada, and a research advisor to the Indigenous Resource Network, a senior fellow at Arctic 360, and a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Okay, let's not go through that again, but it's pretty impressive. Welcome, Heather. It's really nice to meet you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's great. I can't believe two women from Saskatchewan didn't already know each other. There's not that many of us. All right, let's just start with your position on this, that we do have the resources, but not the attitude. And I don't know how many fronts I've heard that on, but explain.
Yeah, well, now I'm delighted that this idea that Canada could be or should be an energy superpower has become mainstreamed. And you would probably remember Senator, Stephen Harper talking this way in 2006. Right. It's been a little bit, I have to say, ridiculed or kind of poo-pooed since then. And now it's back in style. So what is it, what is it that Stephen Harper saw was the opening of the oil sands, where, we always knew we had this resources for several decades, but the technology and the innovation finally made it economic. And so we saw that this enormous reserve was about to be unleashed. It has been. We've had a couple million barrels since then. But what did we do? We did not, build any pipelines until very recently to the West Coast. So we put all that production down to the South. Actually, a fairly, mutually beneficial relationship anyways, North American energy security, all that. The refineries were designed for heavy oil, so the Canadian crude fit very well with that. But basically, we were giving, in excess of 95, 97% of our exports sitting at the United States. We knew we were overly dependent on a single customer. And that really hit us hard in the shale revolution when the United States started producing a lot more of its own oil.
But we still have those drill revolution.
Yes, yes. But we still have the reserves. Americans are depleting theirs. It's likely, certainly at these prices, that shale production has peaked. And so we do see a role, certainly for Canadian oil to be expanded to fill some of that gap that will be left with American production, that will be left with Norwegian production, by the way, which is seeing a peak in its offshore oil and gas production probably this year. So we have all these things, but we just sent it to the United States. So if you were the third largest exporter of oil, you would think that people might know that, or that is important to your foreign policy, or that you used it somehow for these foreign policy ends, whether it's for soft power, helping your allies, helping your alliance, or for hard power to, kind of quash some of the things that would be against our values in a more coercive way. We've never done that, of course. Saudi Arabia does it all the time. Russia does it all the time. The United States is starting to do it, but we've never even thought about it. And that's what I find stunning, that you have this enormous geopolitically significant resource, and we have never thought of using it in any geopolitical way. So
no,
that's
in fact, when in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and when asked by some of our European partners if we would step up LNG and maybe help them out, we said no business case. So this continues to be a problem. Okay, I'm just going to back us up a bit here, because this is something else really interesting that you've written, that in Canada, I'm going to try and set the stage here before we drill down, as it were, into some of the other issues. 3 world-class energy reserves in this country: oil sands in Alberta, the natural gas basins in BC and Alberta, and the Athabasca uranium basin in northern Saskatchewan. These are big. You're not even counting Ring of Fire and other Newfoundland and other places.
No, it's true. We do have oil and natural gas in uranium elsewhere, but in terms of a world-class deposit where you were likely where you were highly competitive, these are very highly competitive global markets. But these ones, where you would be, the last standing, last man standing. People think the oil sands is an expensive barrel. It's no longer an expensive barrel. They really got
The
the
technology,
prices
right?
down. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I was actually on a tour of the oil sands yesterday and got to see the latest and the greatest. And they invest where they are safe at $45 WTI. And that's basically
Yeah.
a crash and recession. So, but the oil sands, I think we all know, it's the world's fourth largest reserve. Behind Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela. So, do we want only Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iran, to kind of dominate that oil future? We certainly don't. So important that you have a democracy on that list. The gas again is a product of innovation, of that kind of the shale revolution was hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and that those technologies we've brought into Canada, and so opened up these very large basins that it's been there for hundreds of millions of years, but again made it very economic. And people don't appreciate in this country, but often AECO, that's our benchmark natural gas price hub, that's usually the cheapest in the world. And part of it is because we're landlocked and we haven't been able to get it out. Finally, that will change with LNG Canada. But a very competitive, very, very, economic natural gas. And then our favorite senator is the Athabasca Basin. And that's the one I think has flown under the radar. And nuclear, has ebbed and flowed in popularity. Of course, in the last 3 years, it has flowed. And so people, exploration spending, construction spending. There's a couple of mines very near greenfield projects. There aren't a lot of those in Canada. So new greenfield projects very close to start construction. And of course, Cameco and Orano and their historic production. So we're the number 2 producer, number 2 exporter of uranium. And, the alternative is Kazakhstan, and very much China and Russia are putting the squeeze on Kazakhstan, trying to monopolize its products. So if we want to have a reliable resource for the West, and we do, it's going to have to come from Canada to a large extent.
This is, I guess, what puzzles you and me and many other people, which is we are this massive participant in the energy field in the world. And is it still fair to say, I'll ask you this, that we are one of the cleaner producers? I mean, you can get your oil for Venezuela or Russia if you want, both physically and politically a little dirty around the edges. So can we really claim that we are greener and cleaner?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely, and across any variety of commodities, and I've written on this too. And so part of it is that what we normally develop in Canada are these world-class, very high-grade reserves, and when it is a higher grade or higher quality, it just takes less processing, less moving of ore, all those things that just make there's less intensity in the production, and so you just have a lower GHG. We also happen to have very high environmental standards, very high social standards. So that, of course, helps. So those, and so natural gas, absolutely. We know that our LNG is going to be the most GHG, the least GHG intense, the most competitive on the carbon front of any LNG in the world. And part of that is because the third factor is hydroelectricity, that a lot of our production uses hydro. And so your inputs are also cleaner. And we happen to have a very clean grid in Canada. So LNG, absolutely. Athabasca Basin, also very, again, when you're competing against Kazakhstan, that you often have, just greater inputs and that kind of thing. And then on the oil, that's the one that, obviously, has got a terrible reputation, but really doing amazing things. And like I say, it was up there, the thing that you have in your mind with the oil sands is kind of the Mordor, and you're looking over and it's the oil sands mining. But that, 80% of it is the SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage. And that is a much
just explain that a bit, because I've seen it too, but it's a very, very small footprint. It's not these massive, vast swaths of land in which, covered with dead birds. Like these are small, literally put it in in a house. And so recycle the water. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So Christina, I have these numbers fresh in my mind. So Christina Lake, Cenovus owns it, produces about 240,000 barrels a day. So that's significant in the world on a 10-kilometer square footprint. And so if you think about the economic activity, the production generated from that footprint, when you fly over it, you can see it for sure, but not, compared to flying over Saskatchewan with the farmland. And there is disturbance there, but people like you and me happen to find it beautiful, that farmland and how we've, turned that into something that grows food for people. So there is some disturbance, but it's very limited. And so what the SAGD or this, it's mostly underground. There's 10 times more infrastructure, hundreds of meters underground than there is above ground, whereas the mining is a surface, kind of thing. But 80% of what's happening in the oil sands is that subsurface SAGD. So lower footprint, that means, the caribou aren't as affected, the birds aren't as affected. And they try to limit the cost. The input of the cost is the steam. So you do need to generate that heat, and then that does take energy to generate. That's where a lot of the emissions come from. Well, they want to reduce, that's the cost for them. So they try everything they can to reduce that cost, to generate steam more efficiently, to insulate it, and to get it out, with as little of that input as possible. And they're getting better and better and better at it. And they have every incentive to do so. So, and I have to say, we're comparing, we produce a heavy oil, and all heavy oil has a higher carbon intensity. But refineries, we actually need heavy oil. It's not interchangeable with light oil. There's certain products that come out of heavy oil that we have to have. And our competitors who produce heavy oil almost always do it at a far higher rate than us. If you look at California, if you look at Mexico, if you look at Venezuela, their GHG intensity per barrel is much higher than the Canadian oil sands. So if you're doing a fair comparison and acknowledge that the world does need some heavy oil, I promise you'd rather have it from Canada.
Yeah. All right. So your point of the necessary tools, and I guess this where it comes to the political intersection, which is whether or not you can develop this cleaner, greener resource and market it to the world if you do not have the transmission lines, if you do not have the pipelines to get it from point A to point B. Just the day after the election, we heard the leader of the Bloc Québécois said, no pipeline, never, ever, read our lips, going through Quebec. That means, we'd have to explore some alternative through Churchill and go kind of the northern route if anybody was willing to do that. And then I also need from you kind of an update on where we are with TMX and how much goes through that. Then we'll get to the regulatory stuff, Bill 69 and all those other things. But just give us the transmission function. Where are we?
So we in the oil business, they call it egress. And so that's, again, the ability to get your product to market. And we know in Saskatchewan that green farmers, canola farmers are often challenged at harvest time to get their product to port in an efficient way, in a way that their customers expect it. We've had a lot of labor action on railroads and ports, and that causes, kind of great anxiety and frustration and leaves money on the table. Absolutely. Same for potash. We have the world's number 1 resource. Most of what gets shipped out of the Port of Vancouver is potash, coal, and grain. And when, we don't have a lot of redundancy there, someone that you can move to Prince Rupert. So the rail part is actually very important, especially for if you say, we need to diversify our economy, then we better have, some more redundancy and some more predictability with our rail and make it easier to build ports. We'll get to the regulatory, but Vancouver, Port of Vancouver sure had a hard time getting their port approved. And that's a major port for Canada to export. So that's one thing. On the pipeline side, we're up to over 5 million barrels of oil that we produce in this country every day, and we export, a very significant chunk of that. And so, that in January, we are actually to the United States exporting 4.4 million barrels a day. And a couple 100,000 out west to Asia as well at the same time. So just an enormous amount of, and so how do you move all that? Exactly. And of course, as we all know, we've made it difficult in this country really since the oil sands really expanded to allow the oil sands to flourish and to grow by increasing that capacity to west or east. And so we did, so Keystone, not Keystone XL, but Keystone was built in the kind of early, around 2010. I think maybe went to production 2011, somewhere around there. And that really increased our ability to get some more product. It allowed production to grow. And then we thought we were going from there. Enbridge got line 3, again, going to the United States. Was the easiest path. And we were saying, gosh, we need an Energy East, or we need a Northern Gateway, or we need a Trans Mountain. And we actually would love to have all 3 on top of a Keystone XL. That is the quality of our resources, that we could have used so many of these pipelines. But the only one, that we got over the hump was Trans Mountain. And of course, that was, disastrously overpriced.
Right. So the Americans, Joe Biden, when he came in, shut down the Keystone. Day one. Literally one of those executive orders.
Yeah.
So that is still not functioning and not there, and that route is not available.
It's not available. TC Energy actually has become a natural gas company since then.
Yeah.
So South Bow is the oil company that would have done it. I mean, they can't express any more clearly that they have no interest. Why is that? If people want to know, their investors will not reward them if they say, we're going to go down that path again and maybe spend $1 billion again with not a single dime in return. And you get attacked, and you go through, and you get shut down. Why would their investors ever want to see that? So for the pipeline proponents, where they are looking, because we have made it so difficult to build pipelines in this country, and interprovincial and international pipelines, the only solution now is to expand existing routes. It's just to use what you have.
So the government stepped in on TMX and spent, I can't remember what the final number was, 34 billion.
I've heard 34. I've also heard 37. I guess it depends how you count. But so we all know the horror story. What a waiver cost, and actually, there's a lawsuit now pending of why did it go over cost. So some of the details, we don't know, how could you possibly spend this much on a pipeline? Some of the details are going to come out. But it did serve its purpose. Why did we want that other pipeline? Why did we not want to be dependent on a single customer? You see now with threats of tariffs why you don't want to have just one customer. But from a real economic perspective, is because we've been selling our oil at such a discount to the Americans because our hands were tied. There was basically, they could set their price and we had nowhere else to go. Couldn't put anywhere else.
Our only customer, that's the only place we can get it.
So they get to set the price. So in 2018 was, the most, biggest demonstration of the folly of this is when we had what we call a differential blowout. The difference in the price between the West Texas Intermediate benchmark crude barrel and the Western Canada Select benchmark crude barrel. So the average price of a barrel in Canada, the average price in the United States. And it was I think it was $18 for the Canadian one, and $70 for WTI. So it was over a $50 differential. And so that is just money that we left on the table. Frank McKenna, former Liberal Premier, former ambassador, it was the chair of TV, analyzed it, said that cost us $117 billion to this economy. And so what Trans Mountain has actually done is reduce that differential. So even though the pipeline was so expensive, we are getting more money for every barrel that we do produce. We have been able to expand our markets, and so that the differential has been below $10 pretty steadily, for the past couple of months. And usually we expect it to be $15 or $18. So we are just getting so much more money for those 4.5 million barrels that we're exporting every day. We're getting another $10, $5, $8, on the average for each of those. That, you can see that in the GDP. We're a G7 nation, but that actually gets reflected. It's so much money that it actually gets reflected in our GDP.
It's incredible. All right. So without the Energy East, if Quebec remains with its current position that there will never be any pipeline through or around or even close to the province of Quebec, what does that mean? What does that prevent us from doing, and what's the alternative?
Yeah. So I would say, Energy East would have served a purpose. In terms of energy security for our allies, there's a lot that could be actually produced on the Atlantic coast. That has been missing from the discussion. Is you could ship it from Alberta, but you can also produce it on the Atlantic coast, improve that region's economic prosperity, which we absolutely want to do. And it's also a very complementary crude oil for a lot of what Europe refines. So I would love to see more Atlantic production. And there's, potential for
it. Is that offshore or is that onshore?
That is mostly offshore for the
Okay,
oil,
right.
but Quebec has natural gas, and great natural gas, frankly. But if Quebec doesn't want to produce natural gas, then maybe that's something we should, because we're already sending quite a bit of natural gas to Eastern Canada. And so you could just have to extend some of those pipelines, that we're already sending again to that part of the world. But LNG in Quebec and oil in Newfoundland and the other offshore, certainly we should be doing. Now, in terms of, what we have out east, and you mentioned, the Western Sedimentary Basin natural gas and the oil sands, it's just much closer for us to go west. And that is a very large and very growing market. So while I always see, we can go east and serve 20 million customers, or we can go west and serve 4.5 billion customers. And we have the resource to serve that kind of customer base, to make an impact and to grow our market share. So now we have Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain, which is great. They are not yet full, neither of them. LNG Canada is probably just going to start producing in the next couple of weeks, and that will start filling up CGL. But you would have LNG Canada Phase 2, which we hope to get a final investment decision very soon, which would really maximize Coastal GasLink, as does Cedar LNG. All those projects use Coastal GasLink. And Trans Mountain is about 80% full already, which happened very closely. It only opened up about a year ago, in May. Yeah, it's May now, so about a year ago. So it opened up, it filled up faster than we all thought, because there has been very strong demand from Asia for that Canadian heavy oil, which is great. Gives you a sense that there's demand for this. It's the proof is in the pudding. But we would like to fill it, and it can also be expanded. If you do some debottlenecking and some compression, you could flow more oil out of there. You would need to accept more tankers in and around Vancouver. But you could expand that by a couple 100,000 barrels without having to build a new pipeline, which of course is what we like to do given circumstances.
Right.
So that's the short term. But then we want to build another natural gas, Prince Rupert gas transmission is near term, and something like a Northern Gateway.
So with Bill 69, what everybody in our part of the world says there'll never be another pipeline bill. Others will be kinder in their description. Bill 48, even the greenwashing Bill 59, which has limited the ability of the energy companies to even talk about what they're doing and promote what they've got. They have the fear of repercussions on that. So what would it take on Bill 69? This has been in and out of the courts. What would it take to make that more workable?
I mean, so
sorry, I know
okay, let's be constructive. Okay, we're being constructive. There's a party government. This is the reality. It is very much the opinion that almost everything you just mentioned is unconstitutional, that the Impact Assessment Act is still to a certain degree unconstitutional. The amendments did not go far enough to address the Supreme Court's concerns. Certainly the clean electricity regulations are unconstitutional. The industrial carbon price may also not be constitutional, given that everything that the federal government argued in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Prevention Act, they have themselves rescinded all the arguments they said why this was necessary. They've repealed their own carbon tax. They've made regional exceptions for the carbon tax. So that one may very well be. And greenwashing is probably also against the Constitution, just basically your free speech. And so all these things, so Alberta can fight, and maybe it will. Is there a shorter way where we don't fight, where we just improve the policy? Yes, the federal government absolutely has those tools. The easiest thing you could do is reduce the project list. So it says it's the list of things that we say the Impact Assessment Act will apply to.
Right.
And if they really just reduce that list of things that really are just under federal jurisdiction, I mean, that's their, that is their right. That is their lane. But they can't, as it says now, things like, refineries, things like oil sands, things like coal mines. Those should not be under federal jurisdiction. It needs to come off the list. Any kind of mine. So we'd like those off. Now, the interprovincial pipelines is federal jurisdiction. You won't get past that. That is their jurisdiction. So we really just want that openness, that they would, that there is a willingness. And we also need BC to come to the table. I honestly think BC is closer to finding, a path forward with Alberta and finding mutual benefit from some new development and new pipelines than Ottawa is. And I think if BC and Alberta, said we want this and we have a good way and we have the First Nations equity,
Right.
That would go a
I
long
want to
way.
come to that too,
Yeah.
because I know you've worked with Indigenous groups, but just on that basic, so you explained on the carbon tax that the end of the world was nigh if we did anything about the carbon tax, but actually, as it turned out, apparently not. First lifting in Atlantic Canada, and then and now across the country. But the industrial carbon tax remains, and of course, that will eventually be passed on to consumers as well. But the emissions cap, which almost everybody in the world has agreed now that that is the equivalent of a production cap. If you put, and this even goes right to the agriculture issue too. If you start to talk about the use of fertilizers and what comes out of the machines that farmers use, the equipment there. So just explain where we are on that. And do those two things have to be dealt with?
Yeah, so I mean, the emissions cap is probably that's an existential threat to the oil and gas sector because and I always say it's not the cap that's the problem. Alberta already had a cap, and we're under our own cap. It's the cut. So go ahead and have a cap, but they're calling that we should cut by 35 to 38% by 2030. Not technically possible without just shutting in production. And why they are so consistent in saying it's not a production cut is because if it is a production cut, it's unconstitutional because then you're interfering in Alberta's natural resources. And so absolutely it will be a production cut. I want to explain to people why. That even maybe technically possible if you spent $500 billion, okay, you could reduce the intensity by that amount. We don't have the time and we don't have the money. And these are publicly traded companies that need to attract investment and need to provide a return. And they're competing against not just other oil and gas companies in the world, but against Google, against Tesla, against Apple, against, so they have to make a return that is comparable to returns you can get elsewhere. And if the government is saying every dollar profit you make for the next 10 years has to just be put into carbon capture and methane reduction, and not into production and not into profits, not into dividends, well, there goes all your investors. And so this is just
this is
reality.
I think the contradiction that it became so obvious in the course of the campaign, which is if in fact, as the Prime Minister did, say we need to have a whole other set of partners to do business with, we can't count on the US. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because apparently he and the president are going to do a deal, says the president of the United States. But until that moment, we're looking, foreign direct investment in this country is at all-time lows. Productivity is at an all-time low. We have debt loads that are unprecedented. We're asking companies to engage in business practices that won't make them any money, and therefore they can't get investors. And why would they do it? They're in the business of doing this. Can you have this onward march? I was just reading this morning, the former British Prime Minister here, Tony Blair, saying that this whole march to net zero is too quick and it's doomed to fail, because you can't do those two things at once. You can't have growth and investment in your economy and find new markets if we're on this unrealistic timetable to get to net zero. So where are we at the confluence of those two needs and demands?
Yeah, great question. And I'll take a very high level at this because you wonder, how did we even come to have these goals? And I absolutely believe climate change is an issue. May disagree to the extent it's an existential threat, or what will happen by 2050 to people. So far, we're still growing as a population and still having more agriculture productivity and more economic growth and that kind of thing. But certainly, it's an issue that we want to address. And certainly, as we know, it costs farmers money, it costs oil sands money. When you have more wildfires, so there's certainly costs involved and cost to biodiversity and that kind of thing. So agreeing that it is, a good social goal to try to address this and mitigate this and have less air pollution in general are good social goals. But where I think it really went off the tracks was making climate policy the only policy The only goal, the only, motivation that we were seeking is just reduce greenhouse gases, and nothing else mattered. And really was, I think, energy illiterate, to not understand the role of energy in our lives, in our quality of life, in our well-being, in our ability to reduce poverty, in our ability to be secure and prosperous in our own nations. None of that was considered in so many of these policies. And the way I like to put it, Senator, is that if I go to the gas station, I can get a liter of diesel, or I can get a liter of water for about the same price. Actually, the diesel is a bit cheaper. Yes, but one of them has 0 calories, and one of them has 10 million calories. And so the value of what you're getting for a liter of diesel to get that kind of energy, and this is, you just can't replace that with solar. You just can't. Not energy is all created equally. This oil can be stored, it can be transported, it is ubiquitous. We can produce 105 million barrels a day of it. No other energy source has those qualities right now. And so it's fantasy to think that people will, the correlation between human development and energy use is perfect. It is a perfect correlation because it is a causation. The more energy you can use, the more your material well-being and your options and you move up the hierarchy of needs towards self-actualization. And so we have had I think we took it for granted that energy was affordable and reliable, and that we would only focus on sustainability aspects. And sometimes those three qualities, I'm sure people have heard of those: affordability, reliable, sustainability. Yep. We consider a trilemma, or three legs of a stool. And what I propose to you is that they are not three legs of a stool. They are a hierarchy, and you have to have affordability and you have to have reliability. And only after those two are satisfied do you have the ability to move on to think about sustainability. And we absolutely should, but now we've done it at the expense of the first two. And so now the house of cards is collapsing.
Yeah. I think that's where people are coming to, and we've seen some extremes from people, ministers like Mr. Guilbeault, who was going to stop building highways and then we wouldn't be able to drive our cars, or the kind of subsidies we've seen to EV battery plants for vehicles that don't work on farm fields or on highways in Western Canada or any place, Northern Ontario, where the temperatures get below -10. Washing machines that, don't clean your clothes because we've put such restrictions on it. There's just a whole lot of, at this age and stage in our development as a society, do we really want to give up heating our homes and cooling them in the summer, or having a shower to keep ourselves clean? Like, there has to be some balance here, as you say, between these objectives, amongst these objectives.
Yeah. So I think the balance is missing, but voters are very clear, and this is, I think the 2010s were a reasonably prosperous, safe time. And so you did have the ability or the luxury to think about sustainability. And I mean, I pay to have my garbage removed. It costs me money, but it's a lot better than having garbage all over my house. Like, there's a clean environment certainly, can cost money, but certainly is valuable, and we assign value to it. And so I'm fine with assigning value to these things, but how do you adapt to climate change is by having actually access to energy and being able to do these things, to mitigate wildfires, to mitigate hot seasons and have air conditioning, to mitigate cold snaps, unusual cold snaps, and have heating. So voters just simply will not choose to have a lower quality of life. And that is a real dilemma. I appreciate that's a real dilemma, but let's do a cost benefit analysis. And am I better off in a 2-degree warmer world with easy access to energy and all the adaptability that affords me? Or are you better off not having energy and going back to kind of 1800s living conditions, which some of the degrowthers would certainly advocate for that? Which society is better off? And I think voters
you wouldn't want to ask the people of Spain these days, who've just been through this blackout because the wind power didn't quite deliver.
Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate these are dilemmas, and we do want to put technology and all sides agree on that. Let's put some money, let's fix some of these problems. I'm a huge fan of nuclear. I think that one really does have potential to replace the way that we use oil and gas and many different ways for heating, for electricity. And it's super smart people, and not a few of them in Calgary also, Senator, billions of dollars being spent in Calgary by the oil companies to solve some of these problems. We are making progress, but to think that voters will accept degrowth or the lower standard of it's just not politically feasible. So let's take a pragmatic approach to this.
So how do you interpret what the newly elected prime minister has been saying? We know some of us have read the book, the 500 pages, the values. He has said repeatedly in many forums that he wants to rewire the entire global economy consistent with net zero. In the course of the campaign, we hear a little bit more about both conventional and greener development across the country. And then you overlay the negotiations that are set to begin with the United States of America on tariffs, on our trading relationship, on our security relationship, you name it. And Donald Trump's views are pretty clear, the shorthand being drill, baby, drill. So where do you see Prime Minister Carney having to go with this issue? Is there going to be some water in the wine on rewiring the whole world economy consistent with net zero?
Well, I mean, there has to be, and it's not even necessarily a Canadian decision. The world has shifted back to the right. This Canadian election saw, regardless that the Liberals won, the population moved to the right on many of the questions. The United States has moved quite a bit to the right, but it's Germany, it's France, it's not. So we went too far, too fast, or too expensive. Frankly, is the way to put it. We sacrificed some of our energy security, not just on a geopolitical level, but as you refer to Spain, also at a domestic level. That reliability that people absolutely expect. And so there is some recalibration, a healthy, very healthy recalibration. And Canada will have to fall into, like everyone else, we're not immune to those forces. And frankly, the money's ran out. That we spent 10 years, all of us spent 10 years investing into some of these, green strategies that had no return on investment. EVs didn't take over internal combustion engines in the way that we thought. Solar didn't take over natural gas for electricity in the way that we thought. We're still, reaching new peaks of fossil fuel demand every year, as we have, for the last couple hundred years. And so you need a recalibration. So now Prime Minister Carney is the prime minister of the country that is the third largest exporter of oil in the world, the most important source of democratic oil and natural gas going forward. We're competing with China in AI. AI is about energy. Whoever has the most accessible energy will win the AI race. And so these are just so it's you can't we don't have the luxury of just having environmental foreign policy or just having environmental domestic policy. There are so many other things important. And we do have a world-class oil and gas sector that we can be proud of. And we absolutely need that economic growth to be strong and resilient to the forces around us, which is what I think the Trump administration has awoken us to.
I want to come back just as we end to where we began with your comments, which we can be this superpower, but the attitude has to change and the rules and the tools have to change and be allowed to grow. Can we heard a lot, Prime Minister Carney talked a lot about catalyzing and using government as the catalyst on all of these things. Can you replace the risk-taking, the entrepreneurship, that attitude that you talk about, the wealth creation? Can you replace that, or can you really feed that with government subsidies or handouts of some kind? Do we need a larger separation between the state and the private sector if we're going to see this, or do you see a possible marriage?
So, ideally, I certainly come from, a free market stance, and not least a senator because of all the work I've done on Indigenous economic development, where government is usually the problem, not the solution. And so We have the CEOs, we had the letter before the election, the 14 CEOs of the biggest oil and gas companies. Yesterday, we got a similar letter, a bit more specific from the 38 CEOs of the biggest oil and gas companies. They are asking to be unleashed. They think they'll easily contribute to a stronger, more sovereign Canadian economy, Canadian nation, if we unleash them and take off some of the shackles that we have put that sector under, and we would all benefit from it, and our allies would also benefit from that. And so that would be certainly the path forward they see. Now we have dug ourselves into such a hole that there is, certainly an argument that I would entertain that we do need the government to be a bit more proactive. That it is very difficult. A pipeline proponent would have to see a very different government stance to feel confident that they could build a pipeline, economically in this country. And so things like Indigenous equity is certainly one way. I think that, covers a lot of our social goals, but does require the government to step in and provide those loan guarantees, for example, to Indigenous communities. In terms of a corridor, yes, clear the way. That's regulation, though. Like, make it easy, attract investment, instead of disincentivizing them or punishing them or thinking that you need to defend Canadians from people who build infrastructure.
My experience, and I'm interested in yours, with the Indigenous communities. We did a whole study on this on the Senate of a transmission corridor that would include everything. I mean, oil, gas, and also internet, everything, and get pre-approvals for all of that. Most of the Indigenous groups that we met with and heard from said, bring it on. We want the equity. We want the jobs. We want to participate. We want to be at the table. And then let's go.
Yeah, well, there's two corridors actually being proposed right now, Senator, and they're both driven and led by First Nations. So one is the corridor to Churchill, that is owned by Arctic Gateway Group, which is a group of a couple of dozen of First Nations out of Manitoba that would like to see a corridor extended from Alberta. And the other one is the Arctic Security Corridor, which is being led by the territories, but also by the Inuit. So the West Kitikmeot Association is the one that is a proponent for the Nunavut section, for example. There's your evidence. The ones that are actually being called for are being led by Indigenous groups. And that has been my experience. We did things poorly. There's no denying that we did things poorly in the 20th century, that we disregarded Indigenous rights as much as we could. Every opportunity we had to disregard it, we took it. And that was not fair, and it did not lead to an equitable, healthy society. And the courts have insisted now that we do have a duty to consult and accommodate, and it's no longer a nice to do, it's a need to do, but it's also opened up the conversation to do things differently and better. And in my many experiences with Indigenous groups, I always say that what I mostly hear is we are not against development, we are against being left out. And our country is so rich in natural resources and so blessed and so abundant. This is not a zero-sum game. We can all benefit, and that's why I find it so frustrating that we have squashed our resource sector to the extent that we have, because that has provided the best opportunities for Indigenous communities and families and workers to get out of the poverty that we, pushed them into in the last couple of centuries. So let's use our resources to make everyone more prosperous.
It's just wonderful to talk to you. Of course, I have my biases that everybody that comes from Saskatchewan, of course, has a good brain. And because they've lived in an environment that's pretty tough to deal with, you become very pragmatic and very, you just apply common sense to this. And you've done some amazing work as I've started to read on this. So thank you so much for the contribution you're making to the public debate about this, and also for being here today. I really, really appreciate what's going on inside of that head of yours.
Likewise, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
It's great. I'll do the mini version as I thank Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada, and working with the Indigenous Resource Network. So that is Energy 101, or maybe 319, if you're interested on what's going on in this country and where we're headed now with a new direction and new leadership. We'll see if any of this comes to pass. We'll be talking to you very soon. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks very much.
That's great. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wall. And we'll talk to you very soon.